sun was dipping low when the four friends arrived at the campsite, their car kicking up dust on the narrow dirt road that led to the secluded spot by the lake. The trees closed in around them like silent sentinels, their tall, shadowy forms blotting out the late afternoon light. The air was crisp, carrying the faint scent of pine and the earthy tang of the forest floor. "Man, this place is a vibe," Daniel declared as he hopped out of the car, stretching his arms wide. He gestured dramatically toward the lake, its surface glinting like molten silver in the fading sunlight. "Bet this is gonna look sick on Insta." Evelyn rolled her eyes as she grabbed her backpack from the trunk. "Seriously, Dan, we're here for fresh air and disconnecting from the grid, remember? Not your influencer ambitions." "Can't it be both?" Daniel shot back with a grin, snapping a quick photo of the lake. #blessed. Lila chuckled softly, adjusting the strap of her duffel bag. "Just don't ask me to be in your posts. I'm here for the trees, not the likes." Mark, the last to step out of the car, stood for a moment, staring at the lake. His green eyes were distant, as if seeing something the others couldn't. He said nothing, just slung his bag over his shoulder and walked toward the clearing where they planned to set up camp. Setting up the campsite was a flurry of laughter and friendly banter. Daniel wrestled with the tent poles, cursing under his breath when one snapped back and hit him in the forehead. Evelyn, ever the pragmatist, was already unpacking the cooking gear, her sarcastic commentary keeping the mood light. "You know, Dan," she said, smirking as she handed him a roll of duct tape. "Maybe if you read the instructions, you wouldn't be losing a fight to a piece of nylon." "Instructions are for quitters," Daniel replied, wincing as he pressed a hand to his reddening forehead. "I've got this." Lila knelt nearby, carefully laying out sleeping bags inside the partially assembled tent. "I give him 10 minutes before he gives up and asks for help," she murmured to Evelyn, who snickered in agreement. Mark busied himself with gathering firewood, moving quietly among the trees. The others barely noticed his absence until he returned, his arms full of dry branches. He dropped them in a pile near the fire pit and stood back, his expression unreadable. The fire was roaring by the time the sun disappeared completely, leaving the campsite bathed in the warm, flickering glow of the flames. Daniel was in charge of roasting hot dogs, though his tendency to hold them too close to the fire resulted in more than a few charred casualties. "Dude, you're burning them," Evelyn said, wrinkling her nose as she watched another hot dog turn black. "We're supposed to eat those, not use them as torches." "Relax," Daniel replied, pulling the skewers back. "I'm just adding extra flavor. It's called smoky essence." "It's called cremation," Lila quipped, earning a laugh from Evelyn. Mark sat apart from the group, his plate untouched. He stared into the fire, the orange light reflecting in his eyes, giving him a haunted look. Evelyn noticed his silence and nudged him gently with her foot. "You good, Mark?" she asked. "You've been quiet all day." Mark blinked, as if coming out of a trance. "Yeah," he said softly, his voice barely audible, just tired. Daniel, oblivious to the tension, changed the subject. "All right, what's next? Ghost stories? Scary lake legends?" Evelyn raised an eyebrow. "Seriously? You want to freak everyone out right before bed?" "Come on, Ev," Daniel said, grinning. "It's tradition. You can't camp without a few spooky stories. Besides, this place practically begs for it." Lila shivered, glancing toward the dark silhouette of the forest. "Let's not tempt fate, okay? The lake's creepy enough without adding made-up monsters." "Made up," Daniel said, feigning offense. "I'll have you know, the best legends always have a grain of truth." Despite their teasing, the group eventually settled into a more relaxed rhythm. They toasted marshmallows, shared jokes, and talked about everything from college stress to childhood memories. For a while, it felt like any ordinary camping trip, the laughter and warmth pushing back the encroaching darkness. But as the hours wore on, the atmosphere began to shift. The fire burned lower, casting long shadows that seemed to stretch and twist with a life of their own. The once jovial conversation dwindled into silence, broken only by the occasional crackle of burning wood and the distant rhythmic lapping of the lake against the shore. Lila was the first to notice. "It feels different," she said quietly, her eyes fixed on the lake. "Like the air's heavier." Evelyn, who had been poking at the embers with a stick, frowned. "Probably just your imagination." "No," Mark said suddenly, his voice startling them. He hadn't spoken in over an hour. "She's right. The lake, it feels alive." Daniel snorted, though the sound lacked conviction. "Okay, Mark, time to lay off the creepy vibes." Mark didn't respond. His gaze was locked on the water, his face pale and unreadable. The others exchanged uneasy glances, the earlier lightheartedness now a distant memory. "Maybe we should call it a night," Evelyn suggested, her voice unusually soft. "It's late." No one argued. They doused the fire and retreated to their tents. Soon the soft rustling of sleeping bags and the gentle hum of the forest filled the night. Mark's sleep was restless. He dreamt of the lake, its surface dark and unbroken, mirroring the dense canopy of stars above. He found himself standing on the shore, his feet sinking slightly into the damp sand. The air was thick, oppressive, as if the lake itself were breathing. A voice, low and echoing, called his name from the water. It wasn't familiar, yet it stirred something deep within him, a compulsion he couldn't resist. He stepped closer, the cold water lapping over his shoes, soaking through to his skin. "Who's there?" he asked, his voice trembling. The water rippled, and from its depths emerged a faint silhouette. It moved closer, its features obscured until it was only a few feet away. Mark froze as he saw it, a face, gaunt and hollow, with sunken eyes that seemed to pierce straight through him. Its mouth opened, but no sound came, only the chilling sensation of cold air brushing past him. He stumbled back, gasping, but his feet wouldn't move far enough. The face remained, its features distorting as if the water itself was alive, shifting and writhing around it. Mark tried to scream, but the sound died in his throat as he jolted awake. His heart pounded in his chest, his skin slick with sweat, despite the cool night air. He sat up, glancing around the tent. Everything was still, the faint snores of his friends the only sound. It was just a dream, he told himself, though the icy dread clinging to his bones made it feel far too real. Morning came bright and clear, the sun cutting through the mist that hovered over the lake. The group woke in surprisingly high spirits, the unease of the previous night seemingly forgotten. Daniel took charge of breakfast, frying eggs and bacon on a portable stove while Evelyn brewed coffee. "All right, team," Daniel said, clapping his hands together. "Once we're fueled up, let's explore. This place is too gorgeous to just sit around all day." Evelyn raised her mug, smirking. "Lead the way, Captain Adventure. Just try not to get us lost." Lila smiled, pulling her jacket tighter against the cool morning breeze. "I wouldn't mind a walk. The forest looked amazing yesterday." Mark stayed silent, his gaze drifting back to the lake. When the others called out to him, he shook off his thoughts and joined them, forcing a smile. "Yeah," he said. "Let's see what's out there." The group stepped onto the forest path, the morning sun filtering through the canopy above in golden streams. The towering trees stood like ancient guardians, their thick trunks covered in patches of moss and lichen. The undergrowth was a tapestry of ferns and wildflowers, while the faint rustle of leaves created a soothing backdrop. Shafts of sunlight pierced through the gaps in the branches, illuminating dust motes that danced lazily in the air. The forest exuded a sense of timelessness, as if it had been untouched for centuries. Birds chirped in the distance, and the air was crisp and refreshing. Daniel, leading the way with exaggerated confidence, waved his arms like a tour guide. "Welcome to the wilderness, ladies and gentlemen," he said in a mock-serious tone. "No Wi-Fi, no coffee shops, just good old Mother Nature." "Yeah, and probably a lot of mosquitoes, too," Evelyn quipped, swatting at her arm. "Ah, the charm of the great outdoors," Daniel replied, unfazed. Lila walked a few steps behind them, her hands tucked into her jacket pockets, as she took in the scenery. "It is beautiful," she admitted, glancing at the towering trees that seemed to stretch endlessly upward. "I can see why people write poetry about places like this." Mark trailed at the back of the group, his gaze fixed downward, lost in thought. Every now and then his eyes would dart toward the direction of the lake, visible through gaps in the trees. His silence didn't go unnoticed. "Mark, you're bringing down the vibe, man," Daniel called over his shoulder, half joking. "Say something uplifting about the forest. Inspire us." Mark looked up briefly, his expression neutral. "It's quiet." "Well, that's something," Daniel said, raising an eyebrow. "Thanks for that burst of enthusiasm." The group laughed lightly, but Lila's smile faded as she noticed Mark slowing his pace. She hesitated but decided not to press him, chalking it up to his usual introverted nature. They continued along the winding trail, the forest around them growing denser. Shadows danced between the trees, and the earthy scent of moss and damp wood became stronger. The group's chatter filled the air, a mix of jokes and half-hearted complaints about the uneven terrain. But when they reached a bend in the path, they realized Mark was no longer behind them. "Wait," Evelyn said, stopping abruptly. She turned to look down the trail. "Where's Mark?" Daniel shrugged, turning as well. "Probably wandered off to brood somewhere." "That's not funny," Lila said sharply, her brow furrowing. "We should go back and look for him." Before they could take a step, the sound of rustling leaves caught their attention. Mark emerged from the trees, his face lit up with an unusually bright smile. His hair was slightly tousled, as though he had been running, and faint smudges of dirt marked his hands. There was a strange flicker in his green eyes, something almost too bright, as if he'd seen something that eluded explanation but left him exhilarated. His green eyes, which had appeared haunted just minutes earlier, now sparkled with an almost unnatural cheerfulness. "There he is," Daniel said, a mix of relief and confusion in his voice. "Where'd you go, man? Taking selfies with squirrels?" Mark's smile widened as he shrugged. "Just needed a moment to myself. The forest is amazing." Evelyn's eyes narrowed slightly. "You okay? You seem different." "I'm fine. Better than fine, actually, Faiku," Mark replied, his tone unusually buoyant. Lila exchanged a glance with Evelyn, both of them clearly unsettled by his sudden change in demeanor. But Daniel, ever the optimist, clapped Mark on the back. "Glad to see you're finally enjoying yourself," Daniel said. "Now let's keep moving before this turns into a search and rescue mission for real." The group fell back into step, though the mood had subtly shifted. Mark's newfound energy was almost infectious, but something about it felt off like an out-of-tune instrument in an otherwise harmonious song. They followed the trail deeper into the forest, their footsteps crunching softly on the dirt path. The air grew cooler, and the sunlight filtering through the trees took on a dappled, dreamlike quality. Before long, the path opened up into a clearing. The grass was lush and green, dotted with wildflowers that swayed gently in the breeze. At the center stood an ancient oak tree, its gnarled branches stretching wide like arms welcoming them. "Wow," Lila breathed, stepping into the clearing. "This is incredible." Evelyn nodded, her eyes scanning the tranquil scene. "It looks untouched, like something out of a fairy tale." Daniel dropped his backpack onto the ground with a dramatic sigh. "Perfect spot for a break," he declared, flopping onto the grass. "Who needs coffee shops when you've got this?" Mark lingered at the edge of the clearing, his eyes fixed on the oak tree. His smile had faded, replaced by an expression that was harder to read. Somewhere between awe and unease, Evelyn noticed and walked over to him. "What do you think?" she asked gently. Mark didn't respond immediately. When he finally did, his voice was quieter, almost reverent. "It feels old, like it's been waiting for us." Evelyn frowned, glancing at the tree. "Waiting for us. What does that mean?" Mark didn't answer, his gaze locked on the ancient oak, as if it held secrets he couldn't quite grasp. Evelyn hesitated, but decided not to push further. Instead, she rejoined the others, leaving Mark to his thoughts. The clearing, bathed in golden light, felt almost sacred. The vibrant green grass seemed too perfect, its edges untouched by the decay of fallen leaves. The air was still unnaturally so, as if the forest was holding its breath. The wild flowers scattered across the clearing swayed in a faint breeze that no one could feel their colors, vivid to the point of surrealism. Beneath the serene beauty, olors vivid to the point of surrealism. Beneath the serene beauty, a subtle unease prickled at the edge of awareness, as if the place was not just alive but watching, waiting for something to happen. Yet beneath its beauty, an unspoken tension lingered, like a whisper just out of earshot. Center of the clearing. They had not noticed it at first, as though it had been concealed by the forest itself, and only revealed its presence after their arrival. The tree's massive trunk was twisted and knotted, its bark dark and weathered, etched with deep grooves that resembled ancient runes. Thick gnarled branches stretched high into the sky, their silhouettes stark against the sunlight. Mark, standing at the edge of the clearing, felt his stomach churn. As he stared at the tree, his vision blurred, and the air around it seemed to shift. Above the oak, black clouds began to gather, swirling and coiling like ink, dissolving in water. The oak, black clouds began to gather, swirling and coiling like ink dissolving in water. They were darker than any storm cloud Mark had ever seen, their edges crackling faintly with an eerie energy. Yet when he glanced at his friends, they showed no sign of noticing the ominous phenomenon. The tree glanced back. "See what? It's just a tree, man. A really cool one, but still just a tree." Evelyn turned, tilting her head in concern. "What do you mean? Are you okay?" Mark's gaze darted between the clouds and his friends. The sky above the tree, it's beautiful. Lila interrupted, her voice filled with awe as she stepped forward. "Look at those patterns on the bark. I've never seen anything like it." Mark opened his mouth to protest, but his words stuck in his throat. A chill ran down his spine as he watched his friends, seemingly entranced, move toward the tree. Panic flared in his chest. "Don't," he shouted, his voice sharp and commanding. "Don't go near it. Don't touch it." The group froze, startled by the intensity of his tone. Evelyn looked back at him, her expression a mix of confusion and irritation. "Mark, what's wrong with you?" Daniel chuckled nervously, trying to lighten the mood. "Dude, it's a tree, not some evil spirit." You don't know that. Mark snapped, his fists clenched. His green eyes, usually calm, burned with desperation. Please, just stay away from it. But the allure of the tree was too strong. Lila, unable to resist, took another step forward. She reached out her fingers, brushing against the rough bark. The moment her skin made contact, her body stiffened, her eyes widened, and a sharp gasp escaped her lips. Lila! Evelyn's voice trembled with alarm as she rushed to her friend's side. Lila's face contorted in a mixture of terror and pain. Her breathing quickened and her knees buckled. Evelyn caught her just as she collapsed to the ground. Lila's lips moved, but no sound came out. Her eyes staring blankly into the distance. Inside her mind, visions assaulted her. She saw the oak tree, but it was different. Its branches were draped with bodies, their limbs twisted unnaturally as they hung like grotesque ornaments. The air was thick with the metallic stench of blood, and the ground beneath the tree was dark and wet. She could hear faint whispers, voices pleading, crying out in anguish. The pain and suffering were overwhelming, suffocating her with their intensity. Lila's hands clawed at the ground as she tried to shake the images from her mind. When she finally managed to scream, the sound was raw and primal, cutting through the stillness of the clearing. "Lila!" Evelyn shouted, shaking her friend. "What is it? What's happening?" Daniel hovered nearby, his face pale. "What the hell is going on?" he whispered. Mark's heart pounded as he watched, frozen in place. He didn't know what to do. The black clouds above the tree seemed to thicken, swirling more violently. He could feel a pressure in the air, an oppressive weight that made it hard to breathe. Evelyn managed to pull Lila away from the tree, cradling her trembling body. Lila's breathing was ragged, her face pale and damp with sweat. Her eyes darted around wildly, as if searching for an escape from the horrors she had witnessed. It's evil," Lila finally choked out, her voice barely above a whisper. "The tree, it's full of death." Mark stepped closer, his voice shaking. "I told you not to touch it. This place isn't right. We need to get out of here." The group exchanged uneasy glances. For the first time, Daniel looked genuinely frightened. The light-hearted banter from earlier was gone, replaced by a heavy silence. Evelyn helped Lila to her feet, supporting her as they moved away from the tree. The clearing, once serene and magical, now felt oppressive and sinister. The wildflowers no longer seemed vibrant, but sickly, their colors too sharp, too unnatural. The stillness of the air felt suffocating, as if the forest itself was closing in around them. "Let's go," Evelyn said firmly, her voice steady, despite the fear in her eyes. "Now." Mark led the way, casting one last glance at the ancient oak. The black clouds above it swirled menacingly, their presence unseen by the others. As they retreated back into the forest, Mark couldn't shake the feeling that the tree was watching them, its unseen eyes boring into his back, and somewhere deep within its gnarled roots, something stirred, their presence unseen by the others. As they retreated back into the forest, Mark couldn't shake the feeling that the tree was watching them, its unseen eyes boring into his back, and somewhere deep within its gnarled roots, something stirred. The group's escape from the clearing was frantic. The oppressive air seemed to cling to them, and the whispers of the forest grew louder with each step, as if the ancient oak's dark energy was pursuing them. Shadows twisted unnaturally in the underbrush, and every snap of a twig made their hearts leap. "We need to stick together," Evelyn urged, her voice tight with fear. She was supporting Lila, whose face was still pale, her eyes darting nervously as though expecting the visions to return. "Yeah, no wandering off this time, Mark," Daniel quipped. though his usual bravado was missing, replaced by a shaky attempt at humor. But Mark didn't respond. He glanced over his shoulder repeatedly, his breath quick and shallow. The sensation of being watched was unrelenting, and though he said nothing, the growing tension in his posture was impossible to ignore. Suddenly, the group reached a fork in the trail. Before they could decide which way to go, a loud rustling came from the bushes to their left. They froze, the sound amplifying their already frayed nerves. "What was that?" Lila whispered, clutching Evelyn's arm. "Probably just an animal," Daniel said, though the tremor in his voice betrayed his doubt. "Let's keep moving." But as they began to step forward, a sudden chill swept through the air, and a low, guttural growl echoed from the trees. Panic set in, and without thinking, the group scattered, each taking a different path. Mark found himself running blindly through the forest, the shadows seeming to reach out and grab at him. His breath came in ragged gasps, his legs burning as he pushed himself forward. The growl grew louder, but when he turned to look, there was nothing there. Suddenly he stumbled into a clearing. The trees formed a perfect circle around him, their branches twisting overhead like a skeletal dome. In the center stood a figure cloaked in darkness, its outline shifting and flickering like a shadow cast by a fire. Mark's knees buckled, and he fell to the ground. The figure raised an arm, and Mark's surroundings shifted. He was no longer in the forest, but standing on the shore of the lake. The water was unnaturally still, its surface reflecting the starless sky. Then, one by one, bodies began to rise from the water. Their hollow eyes stared at him, their mouths moving soundlessly. Mark tried to scream, but no sound escaped his lips. The figure stepped closer, and Mark's vision blurred before he blacked out. Evelyn ran until her legs ached, her mind racing with every worst-case scenario. She stopped to catch her breath, leaning against a tree. The air was still, eerily quiet, and for a moment she thought she had outrun whatever was chasing them. But then she heard it, a soft, childlike giggle, echoing through the forest. Her blood turned cold. She spun around her flashlight, cutting through the darkness, but there was nothing there. "Hello," she called, her voice trembling. The giggle came again, closer this time, and then she saw them, small handprints appearing on the tree trunks around her, smeared in what looked like blood. They multiplied rapidly, crawling toward her as if alive. Evelyn screamed and bolted the giggles, turning into a deafening cacophony. When she finally tripped and fell, the forest seemed to tilt, and she saw a face, her own, twisted in agony, reflected in a pool of dark water. In a pool of dark water. The world spun, and she collapsed into unconsciousness, the undergrowth clutching her sides as her chest heaved with panic. The oppressive whispers from the clearing had followed her, growing louder with each step. Suddenly, the whispers turned into a singular familiar voice, her mother's Lila. The voice called softly, "Why did you leave me?" Tears streamed down Lila's face as she turned toward the sound. Standing just ahead was the silhouette of a woman. Just ahead was the silhouette of a woman. Her features were obscured, but the voice was unmistakable. "Mom?" Lila choked out, taking a hesitant step forward. The figure didn't move, but its voice grew harsher. "You abandoned me. You let me die alone." "No, that's not true," Lila screamed, collapsing to her knees. The figure lunged toward her, its face a grotesque amalgamation of pain and hatred. Lila's screams echoed through the forest as the vision consumed her. Through his veins, he tried to convince himself it was all in his head, just a trick of the light, or their collective imagination. But when he rounded a corner, he came face to face with his worst nightmare. It was a mirror image of himself, but twisted and wrong. The doppelgänger's eyes were empty sockets, and its mouth stretched into an unnatural grin. "You think you're so perfect," the figure hissed, its voice like grinding metal. "But you're nothing, a failure, a fraud." Daniel's legs gave out, and he fell backward. A failure, a fraud. Daniel's legs gave out, and he fell backward, scrambling away from the apparition. The figure lunged at him, its hands clawing at his chest. Daniel's vision blurred, and he blacked out. One spoke as they reassembled their haunted expressions, telling stories. They couldn't put into words. Mark was the last to arrive, his eyes darting around the campsite, as though expecting the shadows to lunge at them. "We need to get out of here," he said, his voice hoarse. "Now." No one argued. They began throwing their belongings into bags, moving frantically as if their lives depended on it. The air was thick with tension, every rustle of the forest setting their nerves on edge. As Daniel loaded the last bag into the car, a cold wind swept through the campsite. The fire pit, which had been smoldering, faintly extinguished. In an instant, the shadows around them seemed to coalesce, pooling into a singular, menacing form just beyond the tree line. "Go get in the car," Mark shouted, shoving Evelyn toward the passenger seat. The group scrambled into the vehicle, slamming the doors shut. Daniel fumbled with the keys, his hand shaking as he jammed them into the ignition. The engine roared to life, and they lurched forward. But as the headlights cut through the darkness, the group froze. The forest path had vanished. In its place was the lake, its surface unnaturally still. Floating on the water were hundreds of bodies, their pale faces turned toward the car. Closer to the shore, some of the figures stood in the shallows, water lapping at their knees, as they stared directly at the terrified students. For a moment, no one moved. The only sound was the ragged breathing inside the car. Then the figures began to move, their limbs jerking unnaturally as they waded closer to the vehicle. Mark's voice broke the silence. "Drive now." Daniel slammed his foot on the gas, but the car didn't move. The wheels spun uselessly, as though the ground itself was holding them in place. The group's screams filled the air as the figures closed in their hollow eyes, glowing faintly in the dark. And then everything went black. Screams filled the air as the figures closed in, their hollow eyes glowing faintly in the dark. And then everything went black.